but sturdy. As he walked through the crowded airport terminal, a quiet determination in his eyes that no one seemed to notice the chaos of rushing travelers around him seemed to make him invisible. Even though he had been walking for what felt like an eternity, his pace was unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world, as if the noise and hurried footsteps of others were a distant echo to him in a life well lived and well learned. He adjusted his glasses and looked up at the large screen displaying flight information. His fingers traced the name of his flight. As he saw the departure time, he nodded to himself, satisfied that everything was in order. He had done this many times before, but today felt different. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the feeling of time moving faster with every passing day. Maybe it was the way the people around him looked young, and in such a hurry he felt something more today, like he had come to a realization that time was both fleeting and infinite at the same time. As he walked toward his gate, he passed by groups of families bustling with excitement, the sounds of laughter and children calling to one another mixed with the hurried voices of businessmen with phones pressed to their ears. The world around him buzzed and hummed with life. He kept his focus ahead, but every now and then a thought crossed his mind. He hadn't always been this way, quiet, humble, reserved. There was a time when his ambition had been his driving force, when the world had seemed like it was within reach, and every decision mattered. But as the years had passed, that burning need for recognition had faded into something quieter, something more meaningful. He turned the corner and approached the check-in counter. The flight attendant barely glanced up. As he approached her, she had probably seen hundreds of passengers, just like him today. They were all the same in her eyes, ordinary tired passengers, traveling to destinations unknown, with no impact, no significance. He knew what she was thinking just by the look on her face. He had seen it before over the years, from strangers who judged him by his appearance. It was a common thing in this fast-paced world, where people only seemed to care about the surface, and the moment she barely acknowledged him was enough to confirm his thoughts. He stepped up to the counter slowly and placed his boarding pass on the counter. Her eyes flickered up briefly, then back down to the screen with no hint of warmth in her expression. "Is this all you have?" she asked, her voice cool, with a hint of impatience. It was clear she wanted to get through her task as quickly as possible. But he only nodded and kept his gaze steady. It wasn't the first time he had been treated like this. But it didn't sting as much as it once had. Not anymore, not. After all the years of living quietly in the background, his success hidden away beneath layers of choice he had made long ago, he had learned that not all people needed to know who he was or what he had done, and in this moment he didn't care to impress her with any of it. But there was something about the way she spoke to him that made him feel small, even if just for a second. She handed him his boarding pass with a slight shake of her head, as if he had somehow inconvenienced her merely by being there. Without a word, she gestured to the side where he could move along, and he did without a word, without any outward sign of the irritation that churned inside him. He was used to being underestimated, but today, for some reason, it felt different. It felt personal, as though she had judged him without even seeing him, and maybe that was the most frustrating part. The man walked away from the counter and toward the gate, still calm, but now with a quiet fire inside him. Something had shifted, a small thing, but enough to make him notice, enough to make him wonder how many people out there like her had passed judgment on him, and for how many years, how many missed opportunities had he let slip by because of the quiet dismissals of those around him. The world was full of them, people who never took the time to look deeper, who didn't understand that everyone had a story to tell if only someone would listen. Help, but notice how much younger they all seemed, their faces bright with excitement, or the cold focus of business travelers, huddled together in quiet conversations, none of them paying any attention to the elderly man who stood just at the edge of the group. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and looked up at the flight information board again, as if somehow it might give him the reassurance he needed. But nothing changed it, still showed the same departure time, and the same destination far away. He felt a twinge of something in his chest, a sense of longing perhaps, not for the destination, but for the time when he had been like them, when he had been in the rush of youth moving with purpose, never stopping to wonder what might come next. The flight attendant's voice broke through his thoughts as she called out for boarding. The announcement sounded robotic and mechanical, and he noticed how she spoke to the crowd with the same detached tone she had used with him at the counter. He felt the faintest spark of annoyance flicker inside him, but he kept it hidden. His eyes remained calm, even as his mind churned with thoughts of how people never really saw him, how they never truly looked at anyone around them. Instead, they only saw the surface, the outward signs that spoke nothing of who they really were. He stepped forward when his group was called, following the flow of the other passengers. He kept his eyes straight ahead. As he moved past the woman standing at the gate, she didn't even look at him as she handed him his boarding pass with a quick gesture that seemed to say she had already decided who he would be, and what he needed, and who he didn't need to be, not even a second glance, or a smile, just a transaction. And he was just another faceless person in the crowd. Yet as he walked past, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had become part of something far bigger than this moment, something that had already been set into motion long before this day. He moved down the narrow aisle of the plane, slowly avoiding bumping into passengers. As they rushed to settle into their seats, he could feel their impatience, the energy of the younger travelers around him, who seemed to be in such a hurry he almost smiled at their eagerness, remembering his own days of impatience, when the world had felt like it was moving faster than he could keep up with. But now it all seemed different, quieter. As he walked toward the back of the plane, the flight attendant glanced up just long enough to direct him to a seat tucked away near the rear. She barely acknowledged him, just another seat, another number, but he nodded and made his way there silently. When he sat down, he placed his small bag beside him and took a moment to adjust the seat belt and settle in his mind, wandered again to thoughts of the younger flight attendants and how quickly they judged people without a second thought, as if their lives were somehow more important or more valid than anyone else as he had seen it, in the way they treated him and others like him with little patience or empathy. He had watched how the world seemed to operate on a surface level, always focused on appearances, never digging deeper, never questioning what lay beneath the surface. The seat was cramped, but he didn't mind it. He had lived with discomfort in many forms throughout his life. It was nothing new. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for just a moment, allowing himself to relax. The soft hum of the plane's engines in the background gave him a small comfort as the plane started to fill with more passengers. The flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, their voices sharp and efficient as they prepared for takeoff. But as they passed by him, he noticed the flight attendant from the gate moving a little faster than she had before, almost as if she was avoiding eye contact with him. And he couldn't help but wonder what she saw in him. Did she see the elderly man struggling to keep up? Or did she see something else, something that told her he was just another invisible person lost in the crowd? As the last of the passengers settled into their seats and the plane's engines began to roar louder, he felt a strange sense of anticipation settle over him, like a shadow falling over the cabin. There was something in the air, something about this flight that felt different, as if it were the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand, something that had started long before he had even set foot in the terminal, but was about to unfold in ways no one on this plane could yet imagine. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a shiver of excitement mixed with fear running through him. He couldn't shake it. It lingered in the back of his mind, like a whisper that he couldn't quite catch, but knew was there. And he wasn't sure whether he was ready for what was about to come next. Lifted off into the air, he glanced out of the window as the city shrank below him, watching the world change from a bustling chaos to a quiet expanse far below, where life continued on unnoticed by those above it, he couldn't help but think about how much of life passed by like that unnoticed by those who were too busy looking at the world through a narrow lens, always rushing, always moving forward, but never really seeing anything. The flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers around him. They were in a hurry, their steps quick, and their voices clipped as they moved from person to person. But when they passed by him, it was as if he didn't exist, as if he were invisible to them. Their eyes never met his, and they never paused for a moment to acknowledge his presence. They simply moved past him with the same indifference they had shown when he first boarded the plane. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his position slightly to get comfortable, though the small space made it difficult to find a truly comfortable spot. The man had never minded discomfort. It had been his companion for much of his life. But what bothered him more than the cramped seat was the way people treated him, as though he were insignificant, just another old man who had lived his life, and was now just waiting to fade into the background. He had seen it all too many times over the years. The dismissive glances, the impatient sighs, the quiet judgments that others cast upon him, without ever taking the time to truly see who he was or what he had done with his life. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that had settled over him, the sense of being judged, the sense that others saw only the surface of his life, and never the depths. He had lived through the choices he had made, the sacrifices he had endured to get to where he was now. But he knew it didn't matter to them. They didn't care to know. They didn't want to know. They simply wanted to make assumptions based on what they could see on the outside. And that was all they ever saw. A loud noise from the front of the plane interrupted his thoughts. He opened his eyes and saw that a passenger had spilled their drink across the aisle. The flight attendant rushed over to help, but her movements were jerky, her irritation clear. She muttered under her breath as she knelt down to clean up the mess. But as she did, she accidentally bumped into the elderly man's seat. The sudden jolt caused him to spill his own drink onto his lap. His eyes widened in surprise, but he said nothing. He simply sat still as the flight attendant continued to hurry past him without even a glance of apology. She was too focused on getting the job done quickly to notice the discomfort she had caused, or the way her actions had interrupted his quiet world. He felt the dampness of the spilled drink soak into his pants, but he didn't react. He didn't even move. He simply sat there, letting the moment pass. Without a word, he didn't need to say anything. He didn't need her to apologize or even acknowledge his discomfort, because he knew that it wouldn't matter to her. He knew that in her world he was nothing more than a blip on the radar, just another inconvenience to be dealt with quickly and moved on from. The elderly man glanced down at his lap and wiped the damp fabric with his hand. He didn't mind the discomfort of the spilled drink. What bothered him more was the feeling of being dismissed once again. It wasn't the drink, it wasn't the inconvenience of the situation. It was the way she had treated him, like he didn't matter, like he was invisible to her and to everyone else who had come and gone through his life. As the flight continued on, he sat quietly, his mind racing through thoughts of all the times he had been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated by others. And yet here he was still standing, still moving forward in his own quiet way. No one had ever really seen him for who he truly was. No one had ever really taken the time to understand the full depth of his life, and he knew that this moment on the plane was just another small reminder that people only saw what they wanted to see. The man shifted again in his seat, trying to find comfort, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that bothered him. It was the emotional weight of all the years of being unseen. It was the weight of knowing that the people around him would never understand the life he had lived, the things he had achieved, the sacrifices he had made to build a life that no one could see. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, he closed his eyes again and let out a quiet breath, wondering if anyone would ever truly see him for who he was, or if he would remain just another invisible traveler passing through the world unnoticed. thoughts, his mind wandered back to the day he had started this journey, not just the physical flight, but the journey of his life, the decisions he had made, the people he had crossed paths with, and the moments when he had felt truly seen. It was a rare thing in his world, but when it had happened, it had been a moment of clarity, something so pure that it had made all the years of work and quiet living worthwhile. But those moments had been few and far between. Most of his life had been spent in the shadows, unnoticed by the world around him. The flight attendants continued their rounds, handing out drinks and snacks as they passed up and down the aisles, but the elderly man noticed how they didn't even look at him. Any more their eyes avoided his face, as if they were afraid to make contact with someone who might disrupt the rhythm of their work. They moved quickly past him, as though he didn't exist. And though he had gotten used to it over the years, today it stung a little more than usual. Perhaps it was the quiet moment in the sky, or perhaps it was the lingering feeling that he was running out of time, and yet no one could see him for who he truly was. The seatbelt light blinked on as the plane began to reach cruising altitude. The movement of the plane felt almost imperceptible, but he could still feel it, his body adjusting to the stillness around him, as if the entire cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. He looked out the window again, watching the clouds pass by beneath him. The world was so vast, so far away, yet so small at the same time. He could barely make out the cities below, the lines of roads and buildings, just tiny dots in the distance. And yet he felt so disconnected from it all, as though he no longer belonged in that world, the world where people rushed and judged and dismissed each other without ever truly seeing the depth beneath the surface. He took a slow breath and leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed for a moment, his thoughts drifting again to the days when he had been more than just a name on a boarding pass, when he had been the one to make decisions, the one who had built something out of nothing and changed lives without anyone knowing it. The thought made him smile a little despite himself, because he knew that he had done it all without the need for recognition. He had lived quietly and yet accomplished so much. But that didn't mean he didn't long for someone to notice, just want someone to see past the surface and truly understand. As if on cue, the flight attendant appeared again, this time with a tray of drinks. She moved down the aisle with the same quick efficiency, and when she passed him, she didn't even stop. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead. But there was something in the way she moved, something in the air around her, that seemed different today. He couldn't quite place it, but it made him feel uneasy. It was as though she was trying to avoid him. And though he knew that wasn't possible, he couldn't help but feel that she was somehow aware of something he couldn't quite grasp. Without thinking, he spoke softly to her, just as she was about to move past him. "Excuse me." His voice was quiet but steady, and she stopped mid-step, turning to face him. A brief look of surprise flashed across her face before she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Yes, sir, how can I help you?" she asked, her voice forced and businesslike. But he noticed the tension in her posture, the way she seemed to hold herself a little too stiffly. He had caught her off guard, and for the first time since boarding the flight, she seemed to take a moment to truly look at him. "I'd like a blanket, please." His request was simple, but his tone was calm. There was no urgency in his voice, but there was something there, something that made her pause. And for just a moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes before she nodded quickly. "Of course, sir," she said, and hurried down the aisle without another word. But he could still feel her gaze lingering, as if she were trying to figure out who he was, what he wanted, why he had asked so calmly for something so simple. He sat back in his seat and closed his eyes again, but this time the weight of the moment felt different. It was as if something had shifted in the air around him, and though he didn't know what it was, he could feel that it was significant, like a change was coming, something was happening, and he wasn't sure what it would be, but he knew it would change everything. And as the minutes passed and the plane continued to glide through the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be unlike any other flight he had taken before. It wasn't just a journey to a destination. It was a journey towards something much bigger, something he couldn't yet see, but could feel stirring beneath the surface. Press in on him as the minutes ticked by, slowly, each second stretching out longer than the last. His mind raced with thoughts of what was happening, of what was about to happen, because he could feel something in the air, something electric, like a storm waiting to break. He couldn't place it, but it was there, and it grew stronger with every passing moment. He had lived long enough to recognize when a shift was coming, and right now he felt that shift coming toward him. The flight attendants continued their rounds, their footsteps quick and efficient, moving past him, as though he were just another passenger, another face in the crowd. But today it felt different. Today he wasn't just another face, not anymore. And he could sense that the flight attendant who had brushed past him earlier was somehow aware of it too, the way she kept glancing in his direction, as if something had changed for her. As well, she tried to hide it, but he noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, the way she seemed more cautious, more aware of his presence, and it only fueled the growing unease inside him. It wasn't long before she returned to his row with the blanket in her hands, her face a mask of politeness, but he could see the small flicker of something behind her eyes, a hesitation that hadn't been there before she stopped in front of him, her gaze locking with his for the briefest of moments. And for the first time since boarding, he saw something in her eyes that made him pause, something that made him wonder if she knew something he didn't. But before he could speak, she quickly placed the blanket on his lap with a polite smile. "Here you go, sir," she said, her voice steady, but he could still hear the faint tremor in it, as if she were unsure of what to say next. He took the blanket from her hands and nodded his thanks, but didn't speak. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, and he saw the way her eyes flickered away, as if she couldn't hold his stare for too long. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it, an unease that seemed to match his own, and for the first time he realized that she wasn't the only one feeling it. He too was caught in this strange web of unspoken tension, and neither of them knew how to untangle it. As she moved away, he settled the blanket over his lap and leaned back in his seat, still unable to shake the feeling that something was off, something was about to happen. And it wasn't just the flight or the discomfort of the cramped space or the way people had been ignoring him for the past few hours. It was something deeper, something that was pulling him in a direction he couldn't quite see, but he could feel it with every fiber of his being. The plane hit a slight pocket of turbulence, jolting him forward in his seat. He gripped the armrests tightly to steady himself, and for a moment the world outside seemed to disappear. The cabin shook violently, and he could hear the murmurs of concern from the other passengers. The flight attendants rushed down the aisles checking on people, but the elderly man remained still, his body tense. But his mind focused. He had seen turbulence many times before. This wasn't anything new, but this time it felt different. It felt like more than just the usual bump in the air. The lights flickered briefly, and a hush fell over the cabin as passengers exchanged nervous glances. The man's heart began to beat faster, not out of fear, but out of an instinctual sense that this moment was part of something much bigger, something he wasn't prepared for, but knew he couldn't avoid. The turbulence passed as quickly as it had come, but the unease in the cabin lingered. The quiet tension remained palpable. For a moment, the elderly man closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to center himself, to find peace within the storm. He had faced many storms in his life, both literal and metaphorical, and he knew that the key to surviving them was not to fight the current, but to let it carry you forward. And as the turbulence settled and the plane returned to its steady flight, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. It had only just begun. When he opened his eyes, he saw the flight attendant again. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something that resembled fear, or maybe it was concern, but it was something real, something he couldn't ignore. She was standing by the cockpit door, and for the first time she wasn't moving with the usual speed and efficiency. She was standing still, watching him, with a look he couldn't decipher, and for a split second their eyes met again, and in that moment he knew that whatever was coming next, neither of them could avoid it. That wouldn't lift the elderly man's mind, raced trying to understand what was happening. Was it just the turbulence, or was something else stirring beneath the surface? The flight attendant's gaze had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something he didn't. He had lived long enough to know when things didn't add up, and right now nothing was adding up. It was as if the universe had thrown a strange set of events his way, and he was the only one who could see the pattern, but couldn't yet grasp what it meant. The cabin had quieted after the turbulence, and the passengers seemed to settle back into their seats. Some were reading their books, others had closed their eyes trying to sleep, but the man remained alert, his senses sharpened as he scanned the room looking for any clue, any indication that something was wrong. But everything appeared normal. The flight attendants continued with their duties, moving down the aisles, handing out drinks and snacks, their faces polite, but distant, as if they were just going through the motions. But the man couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And it wasn't just the minor inconveniences of air travel or the restlessness of long flights. It was something deeper, something that was going to change everything. He glanced over at the flight attendant again, the one who had given him the blanket earlier. She was moving quickly, now her eyes darting between the other passengers, her movements sharp and precise. But there was an underlying tension in the way she walked, as if she were trying to outrun something, or perhaps trying to hide something from the others around her. He couldn't place it, but he could see it in her every action, the way she avoided eye contact with him, the way she kept glancing toward the cockpit door, as if waiting for something to happen. And just when he thought he had imagined it, she paused by the door and looked directly at him, her expression unreadable, but the brief flash of panic in her eyes made his heart race. He turned away quickly, pretending to adjust his seatbelt, but his mind was already working faster than his body, trying to connect the dots. What was going on? Why was she so on edge? Why was she acting like this? Was there a reason she had been avoiding him? Was she trying to keep something hidden from the passengers? Something that she didn't want them to know? Whatever it was becoming more real with every passing second. The plane continued its steady hum, but the man felt the weight of the silence around him. It was as though the air had thickened, and the moments stretched out longer and longer, each passing minute filled with an unsaid tension. He noticed the other passengers no longer seemed as calm as they had earlier. Their movements had slowed, and their conversations had died down. People were shifting in their seats, looking nervously at one another. He caught a glimpse of a woman in the row ahead of him, her eyes wide with fear, as she whispered to her husband, but the words were too soft for him to hear. He leaned back in his seat, just slightly straining to hear the conversation. But all he caught was a fragment of her voice, something about strange behavior, and then the sound of her voice trailing off as she looked quickly over her shoulder toward the front of the plane. He felt his pulse quicken, and his thoughts began to race faster now. What was happening? Was this just his imagination, or was something actually wrong? Were the passengers beginning to notice what he had sensed from the very beginning? Was it possible that they all could feel it too, that there was something wrong on this plane, something no one was saying out loud, but everyone could feel? Just then the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief turbulence. Earlier, we're now back on course, and the rest of the flight should be smooth. We thank you for your patience." His voice was calm, his words reassuring, but there was something in the way he said it that struck the elderly man as strange, like the captain was hiding something too. The man's instincts told him to stay alert, to pay attention to everything that was happening around him, because something wasn't right, and whatever it was getting closer with every passing second. He looked over at the flight attendant once again, her eyes locked with his for just a moment, before she quickly turned away, her expression now a mixture of fear and determination, as if she were trying to hold herself together. Despite whatever chaos was brewing in the air, the man's gut told him this was no accident. This was no simple turbulence. This was something far more dangerous, and he was caught right in the middle of it. In the cabin felt heavier. Even the flight attendants seemed to be moving more deliberately, as if they were all waiting for something that none of the passengers could see. The elderly man sat there, unable to shake the feeling that everything was about to change. His thoughts raced faster than the plane could travel. The unease in the air was undeniable. Something was brewing, and it wasn't just the turbulence that had rattled the passengers earlier. It was something deeper, something more personal, something that felt like it was about to come crashing down on them all, and he was right in the middle of it. He glanced around at the other passengers. They all seemed so unaware, so caught up in their own little worlds. Some were reading their books, others had plugged in their headphones, lost in the rhythms of their music. But none of them seemed to feel a shift in the atmosphere. None of them noticed the subtle tension that hung over the cabin, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. It was strange how oblivious they all were to what was happening around them, to the way the flight attendants had started whispering to each other in hushed tones, and the way the captain's voice had sounded different just moments ago, as if he too was trying to hide something from them. The man turned his gaze back to the flight attendant who had been so tense earlier, the one who had given him the blanket. She was now standing near the front of the plane, staring toward the cockpit, her back stiff, her eyes darting quickly to the door, and then back toward the passengers, her fingers nervously tapping against the side of the seat, as though she were trying to keep her composure, despite something that was threatening to slip free. He watched her closely, his heart pounding, as he wondered what was going through her mind. Did she know something was coming? Did she feel the same unease that he did? Just then the intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. But this time it was different. His tone was urgent, his words clipped as though he were trying to keep a sense of calm, but failing. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a minor issue up ahead. Please remain calm and stay seated. We'll be making a detour shortly. We apologize for the inconvenience. There was a brief pause before the click of the intercom signaled the end of the announcement, but something in his voice sent a chill down the man's spine. It was too brief, too rehearsed, like he was trying to cover something up. And the man could see the flight attendant's eyes flicker toward the cockpit door once again. The elderly man's mind raced. The words minor issue didn't sit well with him, not with the tension that had been building in the cabin, not with the strange behavior of the staff. The unease in his stomach deepened as he tried to piece together what could possibly be going wrong. Was there something wrong with the plane? Was there some sort of emergency he hadn't been told about? Was it possible that this was more than just an ordinary flight? Was there something about to happen that no one was ready for? His instincts screamed at him to do something. But what could he do? How could he act when he had no idea what was going on? He felt helpless, trapped in the middle of a situation where everyone around him seemed oblivious to the growing danger. But the flight attendants weren't oblivious. They knew something. And so did the captain. And the man's eyes narrowed as he realized that whatever was happening, it was happening right under the noses of the other passengers. They were all in danger and didn't even know it. He shifted in his seat, his mind working overtime, trying to think of any possible way to get more information to understand what was really going on. But there was nothing he could do. All he could do was wait and watch and hope that he wasn't too late to understand the truth of the situation. As the plane continued its flight, the cabin grew quieter. Passengers whispering among themselves as they exchanged nervous glances. The man caught a few of their words, but they didn't offer anything more than vague concerns about the captain's announcement and the odd behavior of the crew. But it was enough to confirm what he had been feeling. This was no ordinary flight, and no one in the cabin was prepared for what was about to unfold. And as the minutes dragged on, the man found himself staring at the flight attendant again. Her eyes were no longer darting nervously, but now locked on something ahead of her. With a determination that spoke volumes, she knew something was coming, and whatever it was going to change everything for all of them. As he sat in his seat, his heart racing faster, now the atmosphere had shifted once again. It wasn't just the tension anymore. It was a palpable sense of dread that hung in the air every passing moment. Made it worse, every glance exchanged by the flight attendants, every sudden movement felt like a countdown, something inevitable. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and whatever was about to happen, it was coming faster than anyone could prepare for. He shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests, tightly, his mind running through every possibility, trying to make sense of the situation. But nothing made sense. The captain's announcement had only deepened the confusion. It didn't feel like a minor issue. It felt like something far more serious, far more dangerous. But what could it be? Was the plane in danger? Was there a malfunction? Or was there something else at play? Something no one was ready for. The flight attendants seemed more on edge now, their eyes darting nervously around the cabin. The one who had given him the blanket earlier was standing near the cockpit again, her face pale, her eyes wide. She glanced at the door again before quickly looking away, but he could see it in her face. She was terrified. The elderly man's pulse quickened as he scanned the cabin for any other clues. Every passenger was still seated, looking calm enough. But there was a nervous energy now in the air. People fidgeted in their seats. Some glanced around uneasily, while others whispered to each other. But no one spoke louder than the low hum of the engines. They were all unaware of what was coming, unaware of the danger that seemed to be slowly tightening its grip on them. But the man wasn't unaware. He had lived long enough to recognize the signs. He had seen situations like this before, situations where things weren't as they seemed, where danger lurked beneath the surface. But he had never been this helpless before, never felt so unable to act. He wanted to stand up and demand answers. But what could he say to them who would believe him when they had no idea what was happening? The plane continued its steady course, but everything felt wrong. The air felt too thick, the silence too heavy. The man's mind was racing faster than the plane was traveling. His thoughts jumping from one possibility to the next as his gut twisted in anxiety. He glanced at the flight attendants again. They were moving more quickly now, their steps more purposeful, their eyes avoiding contact with the passengers, as if they were trying to hide something from them. But what could they be hiding? Whatever it was, he knew it had to be serious. He knew that whatever was coming next would be a breaking point, a moment that would shatter the calm facade of the flight and reveal the truth of what was really happening. And then it happened. A sharp sound cut through the quiet, the unmistakable noise of a door opening. The elderly man's head snapped toward the front of the plane, where the cockpit door was now ajar. For just a moment he caught a glimpse of the captain's face before the door closed quickly behind him. The man's heart skipped a beat. Something was off. He could see it in the captain's eyes, the brief look of panic, the way his hand had trembled as he shut the door. It wasn't just a malfunction. It was something far worse. The man's gut told him the worst was still ahead. And now it was all coming to a head. Suddenly the overhead lights flickered once more. This time they dimmed, and then went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. The sudden change made the passengers gasp in surprise. Some screamed, while others fell silent. The only light now was the eerie glow of the emergency lights, casting long shadows along the aisles. The elderly man's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes darted around the cabin in the dim light. He could hear the soft shuffle of feet as people started to stand up, nervously moving about, unsure of what was happening, unsure of what they should do. The flight attendants' faces were now fully visible in the emergency lighting, and he saw the same fear he had seen earlier. But now it was more intense. It was raw and unfiltered, and the tension in the air grew thick as the silence stretched on. And then the captain's voice came again, through the intercom this time. His voice was frantic, not calm, not reassuring. It was full of panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. There is a situation developing. We are taking immediate action." The message cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of static. The elderly man's chest tightened. As he gripped the armrests, even harder, this was the moment he had been dreading, but couldn't quite prepare for. Whatever was happening, it was happening now, and there was no turning back.